The first sound was not of laughter. It wasn't the sound of life. It was the sound of something breaking. A woman's voice shattered in the evening air, thin as glass hitting stone. The words reached him before he ever saw her face, a desperate plea carried on the dying desert wind. "Please, don't look at my scars." He stopped dead in his tracks, the words like a bullet through the chest. The entire world, the whole dusty frontier town settling in for the night, just shrank to the space between his worn-out boots and that one trembling voice. He'd wandered for years, his heart a dry and empty thing, but something inside him stirred. A familiar ache. He had to see, he had to know. He turned, and there she was. She was framed by the crumbling wood of an old barn, a structure that sagged against the edge of town like a tired old man. A thin shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders, a useless shield against a world of pain. Her face was hidden in the shadow of her own hair, and she was pressed so hard against the wall it was like she was trying to become one with the wood, to just disappear forever. But the setting sun, it betrayed her. A single ray of light slipped past the shadows and traced the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw. He should have kept walking. That's what a smart man would have done. She was a stranger, another broken soul in a world that had no mercy to give. But those words, they had him anchored to the spot. They weren't the words of a stranger. They were the words of a memory, a ghost. He took a step closer, slow, cautious, the way you'd approach a deer with a broken leg. She flinched, a tiny, violent shudder, and his heart hammered against his ribs. Because in that split-second flicker of her face, beneath the dirt and the fear, he saw her. He saw the woman he knew from another life, under a kinder sky. Time collapsed. He was a young man again, standing by a river that glittered like diamonds, listening to her laugh, remembering promises whispered like prayers in the dark. She was the dream he'd held onto, the one that was stolen from him without a word, without a goodbye, when the world decided to show its cruelest face. He had searched for years, quietly, desperately, but found nothing. Only shadows and echoes. And now, here she was. Not a ghost, not a memory, but real. And she was changed, marred by hands that knew only how to break things. Her eyes, wide with a terror that seemed permanently etched there, finally lifted to meet his, and deep within them, he could still see it. The tiny, glowing ember of the spirit that had once set his world on fire. The scars were a jagged map of suffering, carved across her skin by a husband whose cruelty was the town's dirty little secret. The kind of secret people tolerated with turned heads and bitter whispers. She clutched the shawl tighter, her voice a ragged whisper, begging him to leave. Telling him she was no longer the person he remembered, that she wasn't worth recognizing. His heart didn't just break, it felt like it turned to dust inside his chest. He didn't see ruin. He saw a survivor. And in that survival, there was a kind of terrible, breathtaking beauty that no fist could ever destroy. He wanted to say her name, Elara. But the word was caught in his throat, a fishhook of grief and rage. He wanted to reach out, to pull her away from that wall, but her trembling held him back. So he just stood there. And he listened. Her story came out in broken pieces, fragments of a nightmare. Each word was heavy with the weight of long nights and endless fear. He felt every lash, every threat, as if it were happening to him. A storm of pure, cold fury began to build behind his ribs, screaming for release. But when she begged him again not to stir up trouble, his hands, which had known so much violence, curled into useless fists at his sides. He was a man of action, but any action here could bring the whole world crashing down on her. Around them, the town went about its business, wrapped in a blanket of willful ignorance. A widow sweeping her porch shot them a single glance, her eyes thick with pity. The bartender stood in his doorway, muttering something under his breath about how some folks just attract trouble. Their attention was brief. This wasn't their fight. They had all learned, one way or another, that some shadows are best left undisturbed. So the cowboy stood there, trapped between a rage that could burn the town down and a restraint that felt like swallowing poison. His silence was the only thing connecting them, a fragile bridge across years of pain. Night fell, dark and absolute. He finally walked away, and every single step felt like a betrayal. The yellow lamplight of the saloon beckoned, promising cheap whiskey and forgetfulness. But no amount of liquor could wash away the image of her face. He lay that night in a narrow, lumpy cot in a cheap room, but he couldn't sleep. Her bruised spirit was burned onto the back of his eyelids, and the voice of that old widow from the porch came back to him, not as a whisper, but as a curse. "He won't stop," she had said, her voice low and certain. "Not until he kills what he owns." The simple, brutal truth of it twisted in his gut like a knife. Dawn came, cold and gray. He didn't wait for reason, didn't wait for a plan. He just moved. He found himself standing outside her door as the morning air cut sharp against his skin. His shadow stretched long and thin across the dust, a dark omen. He told himself he would just watch, just be a silent guardian from afar. But fate, it seems, has no patience for men who lie to themselves. The door creaked open. Her husband stumbled out. Jedediah. He reeked of stale liquor, and his eyes were dull with the flat, ugly arrogance of a petty king. He saw her then, standing fragile in the doorway, and his hand came up, not fast, but with a lazy, cruel instinct that was somehow even more terrifying. The cowboy's breath caught in his chest. The world went silent, replaced by the roar of blood in his ears. All the years of searching, all the nights of silence, all the scars carved on her skin, all the love he had buried alive inside himself. It all converged in that one, single, horrifying instant. He stepped forward, his boots ground against the dirt, and his voice, when it came, was as steady and cold as steel. "No more." Jedediah turned, a slow, mocking sneer twisting his face. The air between the two men grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. The cowboy's hand drifted, hovering just inches from the worn leather of his holster. Ilara gasped, a sound torn between hope and absolute terror. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion. But the explosion that came wasn't the one anyone expected. Jedediah's sneer didn't falter. In fact, it widened. He looked Silas up and down, a flicker of something that wasn't just drunken anger in his eyes. It was recognition. "Well, look what the vulture dragged in," he slurred, but his voice had a sharp edge now. "Been a long time. Caleb." Silas froze. Caleb. A name he hadn't heard in a decade. A name he had buried so deep he sometimes convinced himself it belonged to another man. A dead man. How did this broken-down brute in a forgotten town know that name? Ilara's eyes darted between them, her confusion warring with her fear. She had only ever known him as Jedediah, the monster who owned her. But now, seeing the look on his face, the cold cunning that suddenly sharpened his features, she realized she didn't know him at all. And she had no idea who the stranger was, this man she thought she recognized. "You're a long way from home," Jedediah continued, taking a deliberate step forward. He wasn't just a drunk anymore. He was something else. Something dangerous, in a way Silas understood all too well. Silas saw it then, on the back of Jedediah's hand, half hidden by grime. A faint, scarred tattoo. A symbol. A coiled serpent eating its own tail. The mark of the Black Creek Company. The gang Silas had run from. The men who had taken Ilara from him all those years ago. It wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a random act of cruelty he'd stumbled upon. He had walked right back into the nightmare he'd spent 10 years trying to escape. And Ilara. She was at the very center of it. She always had been. "You shouldn't have come back," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He wasn't talking about the town, he was talking about the past. Then Silas saw it. On Alara, faintly visible on her neck, just below her ear, where her shawl had slipped. The same brand, the coiled serpent. She hadn't just been taken, she was one of them. The woman he loved, the woman he had spent a decade mourning, was a member of the ruthless gang that had torn his life apart. The entire ground had just fallen out from under him. Everything he thought he knew was a lie. Jedediah took another step, his eyes glinting. "She's mine now, Caleb, just like everything else." The fight that was coming wasn't about saving a helpless victim anymore. It was about survival, and untangling a web of lies so thick it threatened to choke them all. The husband, Jedediah, didn't swing a clumsy, drunken fist. He moved with a sudden, brutal efficiency that spoke of countless brawls and a life of violence. He lunged, using the whiskey bottle in his hand not as a club, but as a weighted weapon, catching Silas on the side of the head. Pain exploded behind Silas's eyes. The world tilted, a flash of white light, the taste of copper in his mouth. But he didn't go down. Years on the run had taught him how to take a punch. He staggered back, shaking his head to clear it, and pushed forward, driving his shoulder into Jedediah's gut. The air rushed out of the bigger man with a grunt. This wasn't a bar fight. This was a reckoning. A small crowd started to gather, their faces pale in the morning light. They weren't just curious, they were terrified. They had seen Jedediah's cruelty before, had felt the weight of his presence in their town. But they had never seen anyone fight back. They watched, silent and frozen, as justice, or something like it, was dragged kicking and screaming into the dusty street. The fists landed like hammers. There was no grace to it, just a raw, desperate struggle. Silas's knuckles split, blood dripping hot into the dust. Every blow he took, he saw Alara's face, imagined the lonely, terrifying nights she must have endured. And every punch he threw was a promise that it was over. But the image was tainted now. Was she a prisoner or a partner? The coiled serpent brand burned in his mind's eye. Jedediah laughed, a ragged, ugly sound, spitting blood and insults. "Still fighting for her, Caleb? Even after all this time? You never learned. She was never yours to save." The words were meant to poison him, to break his resolve, but rage had a way of burning poison clean. It hardened in his gut, turning into something cold and pure. Then came the whisper of steel. Jedediah's free hand darted to his belt, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from its sheath. The morning sun glinted off the blade. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was no longer a fistfight. This was murder waiting to happen. Alara cried out his name, his real name. "Caleb!" She took a step forward, as if to intervene, to throw her own body between them. But Silas's arm shot out, not touching her, but warning her back. He turned his body, taking the blade's path on his arm instead of his gut. Fire traced a line along his skin, and his sleeve bloomed red. He didn't retreat. He didn't even flinch. In one smooth, fluid motion that was pure, deadly instinct, his own hand dropped to his hip. The revolver felt like a part of him, an extension of his will. The hammer clicked back with a sound that was louder than a cannon shot in the sudden, dead silence. Jedediah's grin faltered. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear showed in his eyes. He was a bully with a knife. He was facing a killer with a gun, but his arrogance or his desperation kept him moving. He lunged, the gun roared, just once. The sound echoed off the drab wooden buildings, rolling through the silent town. Smoke, thick and gray, coiled in the still air. Jedediah stopped, his body spasming. The knife clattered to the ground, useless. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, his expression one of pure, dumb surprise. Then his knees buckled, and he fell to the earth with a heavy, final thud. Silence. a silence that was deeper and wider than the town itself. Silas stood there, his chest heaving, the gun still smoking in his hand. His arm trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. He hadn't killed a man in years. He'd promised himself he never would again. He didn't look at the body on the ground. He looked at her. Alara stood in the doorway, frozen. Her shawl had fallen completely, leaving her scars exposed for the entire world to see in the harsh morning light. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But she wasn't hiding. Her eyes were not lowered in shame. They were wide, fixed on him, filled with a storm of emotions he couldn't begin to read. Terror, relief, gratitude, and something else. Something that looked like betrayal. Why? The question screamed in his mind. Why the brand? The townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of shock and awe, but no one turned away in disgust at the sight of her scars. A new understanding was dawning. A child, no older than 7, whispered to his mother, his voice carrying in the stillness. "She's brave." The words struck Ilara harder than any fist ever had. She seemed to clutch it to her chest, as if it were a physical thing, a shield. Silas slowly, deliberately holstered his revolver. He took a step toward her. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to touch her. He just let his presence be a question. He had to know the truth. When his hand finally, gently, brushed against hers, it wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was an accusation. He felt her flinch from his touch. "The brand, Alara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Tell me." She pulled her hand away as if burned. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice was steady, laced with a bitterness that chilled him to the bone. "You think he gave me this brand?" she asked, her gaze flicking from his face to the coiled serpent on her own skin. "You think I was one of them?" She laughed, a broken, terrible sound. "No, Caleb. You gave me this brand." She pointed a trembling finger, not at the body of her dead husband, but at him. "This is the mark of the woman you left behind." The world tilted again. His mind raced back, a frantic scramble through a decade of haunted memories. The night the gang attacked their camp. The fire, the screaming, the chaos. He'd been knocked unconscious. When he woke up, Alara was gone. They told him she was dead. He'd believed them. He'd run, and he never looked back. "I thought you were dead," he choked out. "They wanted you to," she said, her voice shaking with a rage that had been simmering for 10 long years. "Jedediah was there. He was second in command. When you ran, you broke their code. The penalty for desertion wasn't death. It was something worse." She looked him straight in the eye, and the raw pain there was like a physical blow. "The penalty was that they took the person you loved most, and they gave them to the man you hated most. They branded me, Caleb, not as one of them, as property, his property, as a living reminder of your cowardice." Every breath Silas took felt like he was inhaling fire. He hadn't just failed to save her. He hadn't just mourned a woman who was still alive. His actions, his running away, had been the very thing that condemned her to this hell. He was the author of her pain. The scars on her skin were his signature. The silence that followed was shattered by a new sound, a slow, deliberate clapping. Silas and Alara both turned. Standing at the far end of the street, leaning against the sheriff's office as if he owned it, was a man. He was tall and dressed in a fine black coat, a stark contrast to the town's dust and grime. And behind him, silent and still as statues, were a dozen more men on horseback. Each of them bore the same serpent brand. The man in the black coat smiled, a thin, predatory slash in his face. "What a touching reunion," he said, his voice smooth as silk and cold as a grave. "It's good to see you again, Caleb. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about us." It was Kane, the leader of the Black Creek Company, the man who had given the order, and he had come to collect his property. Kane strolled forward, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. His men remained mounted, a silent, menacing wall blocking the only way out of town. The townspeople, who had been frozen in shock, began to melt back into their homes, slamming doors and shuttering windows. They knew what this was. This was a storm they couldn't hope to survive. Jedediah was a fool, Kane said, glancing at the body on the ground with casual disdain. Sentimental. He always had a soft spot for you, Alara. He could have broken you 1,000 times over, but he kept you. Preserved. Like a flower pressed in a book, a monument to his own failures. He stopped just a few feet from them, his dark eyes flicking between Silas and Alara. But I am not a sentimental man. Silas moved, placing himself between Kane and Alara. His hand was back on the grip of his revolver. After 10 years of running, his past had finally cornered him. This is between you and me, Kane, Silas said, his voice low and tight. Kane laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Oh, it's always been about you, Caleb. My greatest disappointment. You had such potential. You were supposed to be my right hand, my heir. Instead, you ran, chasing a ghost. His gaze settled on Alara, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I have to admit, I'm impressed she survived this long. Jedediah was instructed to send word the moment you reappeared. I suppose I should thank him for this. Opportunity. What do you want? Silas growled. What I've always wanted, Kane replied smoothly. Loyalty. You see, Jedediah wasn't just watching her. He was watching something else. Something he buried for me just outside this town, my retirement fund. The haul from the Union Pacific train job. The one you were supposed to lead. It all clicked into place. Jedediah wasn't just a guard. He was a treasurer. The town wasn't just a prison for Alara. It was a bank vault. And Kane was here to make a withdrawal. The problem is, Kane continued, tapping a finger against his chin, Jedediah was the only one who knew the exact location. He was paranoid. He never wrote it down, but he was also a creature of habit. I'm willing to bet, he told his favorite pet. His eyes locked onto Alara. This was never just about punishment. It was about security. She was the key. Tell me where it is, girl, and I'll make your death quick, Kane said, his voice losing its silken edge, replaced by cold, hard steel. Alara didn't cower. She didn't shrink away. A decade of abuse at the hands of one monster had forged her into something that would not break for another. She lifted her chin, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. I will die before I give you anything, she said, her voice clear and strong. Silas felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost knocked him off his feet. Kane's smile returned, but it was ugly now. I believe you, but perhaps your protector here feels differently. He looked at Silas. You have a choice, Caleb. Her life or the location of my gold. You can't have both. Convince her to talk, or watch me do things to her that will make Jedediah look like a saint. The trap was perfect. The choice was impossible. But then another voice cut through the tension, a voice that was old and cracked, but held the unshakable strength of forged iron. There's a third choice. Everyone turned. The old widow stood on her porch, the one who had given Silas the warning. She held a double-barreled shotgun, and it was aimed squarely at Kane's chest. You can die, she said. Kane stared at the old woman, a flicker of genuine surprise on his face. He didn't seem to recognize her. And who might you be, old mother? He asked, almost amused. You don't remember me? The widow said, her voice trembling with a rage that had been aging for years, like poisoned wine. You should. You killed my son, Thomas. He was just a boy, a deputy who stood in your way at the crossing in Willow Creek. Recognition dawned in Kane's eyes, followed by a dismissive shrug. I've killed many sons. He was my only one, the widow said. And you're not leaving this town alive. Before Cain could even signal his men, there was a sudden movement. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't the widow. It was Alara. While all eyes were on the new standoff, she had been backing away slowly, her eyes darting around the street. She wasn't looking for an escape. She was looking for something specific. Her gaze locked onto the town's well, right in the center of the square. "It's not about the gold, Caleb," she shouted, her voice ringing with a strange, sudden urgency. "It was never about the gold." She turned and sprinted toward the well. Cain, realizing he was being distracted, snarled an order. "Get her!" Two of his men spurred their horses forward, but Silas was already moving. He fired 2 quick shots, not to kill, but to spook the horses. They reared up, screaming, throwing their riders into the dust. The widow's shotgun roared, a deafening blast of thunder and smoke. One of Cain's men was thrown from his saddle, his chest a bloody ruin. The street erupted into chaos. Gunfire exploded from all sides. Cain's men, recovering from the shock, began firing wildly. Silas dove behind a water trough, returning fire, trying to provide cover for Alara. But what was she doing? She reached the well, but she didn't try to hide behind it. Instead, she grabbed the heavy wooden bucket tied to the rope. With all her strength, she swung it, not at a person, but at the main support beam of the saloon's front porch. The beam was old, rotten. It splintered, then cracked with a groan. "Alara, what are you doing?" Silas yelled over the gunfire. She ignored him. She swung the bucket again. The beam gave way. With a terrible tearing sound, the entire front awning of the saloon collapsed into the street, creating a barricade of splintered wood and choking dust. It blocked the path of Cain's remaining horsemen. It was brilliant, but it wasn't the plan. There was something else going on. Through the dust, Silas saw Cain, his face a mask of fury. He wasn't focused on Silas or the widow anymore. He was staring at Alara, a look of dawning horror on his face. "The map!" Cain screamed, his voice raw with panic. "It's not a map to the gold!" Alara stood by the well, her chest heaving. She looked at Silas, and for the first time, he saw not a victim, but a strategist, a soldier. "Jedediah was a coward," she called out to him. "He was afraid of you, Cain, afraid you'd come back for the gold, so he didn't just hide it, he booby-trapped it." She reached down and grabbed the well's crank. "He told me the location was carved on my back," she said, her voice rising above the chaos. "That was a lie. He just wanted an excuse to hurt me. The real map. He made me memorize it. It's a sequence. And it's not a map, Cain. It's a set of instructions." She began to turn the crank. Not up, but down, loosening it. "Instructions for what?" Silas yelled. Cain finally understood. Pure, undiluted terror washed over his face. "No," he whispered. He wouldn't. "He wired the whole town," Alara screamed, her voice triumphant and terrible. "The old silver mine that runs underneath us. Jedediah packed it with dynamite years ago, enough to blow this whole place off the map. It was his insurance policy. If he couldn't have the gold, nobody could." She gave the crank one final hard turn. The rope unspooled, and the heavy bucket plunged down into the darkness of the well. There was a faint splash, then another sound, a click, a metallic scrape of a trigger mechanism from deep underground. "He linked the detonator to the well bucket," Alara said, a wild, fierce smile on her face. "He told me if I ever saw you again, Cain, I should send you his regards." A low, deep rumbling started beneath their feet. The ground itself began to shake. The entire town was a bomb, and she had just lit the fuse. The rumbling grew into a roar. The very earth groaned in protest. Cracks snaked across the dusty street. The townspeople, the ones who had hidden, now screamed in pure terror. Cain's men panicked. Their loyalty was to gold, not to a madman's suicide pact. They turned their horses, scrambling to escape the coming apocalypse, riding each other down in their desperation to flee. But there was nowhere to go. Cain stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. He had been outplayed. By a dead man, and by the woman he had dismissed as a broken toy. He raised his pistol, aiming it at Alara, a final, spiteful act. But the widow's shotgun spoke again. The second barrel unleashed its fury, and Cain was slammed backward, his black coat ripped to shreds, his plans and his life ending in the same instant. "Caleb, come on!" Alara yelled, grabbing his arm, pulling him from his shock. The world was coming apart at the seams. Buildings groaned, their foundations shifting. The church steeple swayed like a drunken giant. "Where do we go?" he shouted over the deafening noise. "The old storm cellar!" the widow screamed from her porch, gesturing with her empty shotgun. "Behind the blacksmiths! It's deep enough!" They ran. They didn't look back. The ground pitched beneath their feet like the deck of a ship in a hurricane. Silas half-dragged, half-carried the old widow, while Alara led the way, her movements sure and certain. She knew this town, every inch of it. She had been studying it for 10 years, not as a prison, but as a battlefield. They scrambled past the blacksmith shop just as its roof caved in. Alara ripped open the heavy wooden doors of the cellar, and they tumbled down the stone steps into the cool, musty darkness just as the first major explosion hit. The world above them ended in a cataclysm of fire and thunder. The ground heaved one last violent time, and the cellar doors were ripped from their hinges, plunging them into absolute blackness. The sound was indescribable, a physical force that pressed in on them, trying to crush the very air from their lungs. And then, silence. A silence that was more profound, more absolute than any that had come before. The silence of total annihilation. They huddled together in the dark, the only 3 survivors in a town that no longer existed. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Silas could feel Alara trembling beside him, not with fear anymore, but with the aftershocks of adrenaline and a decade's worth of righteous fury finally spent. The old widow was muttering a prayer, her voice rough but steady. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had ceased to have any meaning. Finally, a single, thin ray of light pierced the darkness. A piece of debris had shifted. Silas cautiously made his way up the steps. He pushed aside a charred beam and pulled himself out into the daylight. He was standing in hell. There was nothing left. The town was gone, wiped from the face of the earth. In its place was a massive, smoking crater. The gold, the gang, the secrets, the pain. It had all been scoured away by fire and dynamite. It was a perfect, terrible, cleansing destruction. A ground zero for a new beginning. He helped Alara and the widow out into the gray, ash-filled light. They stood there, the 3 of them, at the edge of the abyss, looking at the ruin of their past. Alara walked over to him. The dust and soot couldn't hide the lines of exhaustion on her face, but her eyes were clear. The ghosts were gone. "You didn't run this time," she said softly. "I had something to stay for," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at the scars on her face, on her neck. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the raised, jagged lines on her cheek. He wasn't seeing a map of pain anymore. He was seeing a testament to a strength he couldn't comprehend. The story of a woman who had walked through fire and refused to be consumed. "I see the woman who lived through it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I see the one I never should have left." She leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance. A forgiveness he knew he hadn't earned, but that she was giving him anyway. The past was a crater behind them. The future was an open, unknown plain stretching out before them. The widow cleared her throat. "The plains are for second chances," she said, her voice gruff. "Best not to waste this one." Silas looked at Alara, at the horizon, at the endless sky. He had fought a man. He had fought a gang. He had fought the ghosts of his own past. And somehow, he had won. Their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of justice from the shadows of the past, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was Alara a hero or did she go too far?